So this is work I've done in collaboration with Jared Piazza, who's a postdoc at Penn, and Paul Rosem. And the topic has to do with the role of character in person perception and evaluation. And this is one of the aspects that our grant is on. There are a few other aspects as well, but we've spent most time thinking about this one, so I'm just going to focus exclusively on this question. So the starting point for our interest in this is a fairly broad question about what sort of information people most care about in others and what sort of information most strongly determines the impressions we form of other people in social life. I suspect if you ask this question to a social psychologist who's well versed on recent social cognition research, they would say something like social warmth is the primary dimension of interest when we form impressions of other people. And in giving that sort of response, they'd be drawing on a very prominent and influential research tradition that has gained in its momentum, particularly over the last 10 years or so. And according to these sorts of models, warmth and competence are two fundamental, roughly orthogonal dimensions that underlie the perception of individuals and social groups. And usually in these sorts of models, warmth is stressed as the primary dimension, with competence as being a sort of augmenting factor. Susan Fisk at Princeton is one of the leading proponents of these kinds of models, and so in 2007 she and her colleagues wrote that research has clearly established that perceived warmth and competence are the two universal dimensions of human social cognition. I'm not going to review too much of the past research on this, but I do want to stress that these models have been hugely influential, and since 2007 they've probably gained even more momentum in the field. They also have deep roots within social psychology, going at least as far back as a paper by Rosenberg in '68, and probably going back a little further than that as well to some of Solomon Asch's earlier work. In Rosenberg's paper, what he asked people to do was to sort 64 different traits into clusters or categories that they thought were likely to be associated within the same person. There's a fair bit of complicated statistical analysis, but the basic upshot is that these traits tended to cluster along these two different dimensions, a social warmth or goodness dimension is how he labelled it, and an intellectual competence dimension. So here's the data from Rosenberg's original investigation. We have the warmth or social pole horizontally, competence vertically. And one observation I want to make about the way the traits get arrayed in this space is if you look at the two extreme ends of the social pole, you see some traits up here, like being happy, popular, sociable, and similarly at the negative end, being unsociable, humorless, pessimistic, that on their face don't seem to have a tremendous amount of moral content. Maybe a little bit, but not a ton. At the same time, nestled right alongside those traits are other traits that seem much more fundamental to morality. So up here we have honest, helpful, sincere, down here vain and dishonest. So the observation we want to make here is that these models don't distinguish between the moral relevance of traits, and they don't really have the resources to distinguish it, given that they just have these two dimensions. So what you see is this kind of general agglomeration of morality and warmth within this overall dimension of warmth. So this is Rosenberg's data, and I just want to point out that this sort of agglomeration that we see is not just a feature of his data. Here's a selection of relatively randomly selected papers over the last 10 years that make a similar point about the way warmth has been instantiated. So sometimes it's tolerance, warmth, good-naturedness, sincerity, good-naturedness, sincerity, friendliness, warmth, friendliness, niceness, sociability, morality, this time trustworthiness, sincerity, kindness, and friendliness. So once again, we see this kind of agglomeration. There are some traits here being sociable, friendly, warm, that don't seem heavily morally loaded, but other traits, like the ones in blue here, being tolerant, sincere, kind, moral, seem much more heavily loaded. So the starting point for our argument here is that we think these dimensions, though related, are separable to some degree. And so there are a couple of sort of key points here. One is that many warmth traits, on their surface at least, don't seem especially relevant to morality. You might think of these as being sort of pure warmth traits, being sociable, friendly, extroverted, humorous, and so forth. I'm not claiming they're not at all relevant to morality, but not as relevant to morality as many other traits. The inverse point also applies as well, which is that many moral traits don't seem especially relevant to warmth. And so we can think of lots of examples like this, being honest, principled, just. And this is the case notwithstanding the fact that sometimes researchers within this two-dimensional tradition have stipulated that honesty and trustworthiness are in fact warmth traits. You might have seen that in one of the previous slides. But that is a purely stipulative move, and there's not really any evidence, independent evidence, to ground the idea that those are actually warmth traits. So we think these dimensions are separable. Just to kind of illustrate this with a couple of examples of well-known people, we might think of somebody like Nelson Mandela as a person having high character and high warmth. Perhaps Wittgenstein as somebody of high character. He was famously brave in war and a principled person, but he was also notorious for having a pretty severe personality, particularly with respect to some of those school children that he was teaching mathematics. Somebody like L. Ron Hubbard, perhaps somebody we might think of as having relatively low character. He did a number of highly dubious things, but he also had a certain kind of personal charm, charisma and warmth, which he used in certain circumstances. Lots of people we can think of in the low character, low warmth bin. Okay, so the general point is we think these ideas, these constructs are somewhat separable. The third point, which I've already alluded to, is that past investigations haven't really measured in any empirically grounded way the extent to which traits are seen as relevant to morality and the extent to which they're seen as relevant to warmth. So that's one issue we also wanted to address. So the overall goal then is to start with this kind of empirical bottom-up measurement exercise where we measure across a whole range of traits how relevant they're seen as being to warmth and morality. And then having done that, to assess which of these dimensions, if either, are actually most important in determining the impressions we form of other people in our social life. So as you've probably gathered, we think moral character is going to matter and that it's going to matter more than warmth. So why is that? There's a few things you can say about this, and none of this is really original to us. So one, I think, fundamental point is that a person's moral character is likely to determine the nature of somebody's intentions towards us, whether they're likely to be good or bad, helpful or harmful. And this is a point that's been made many times in the social cognition literature, but in a slightly different way. So interestingly enough, two-dimensional researchers will often stress this point, but they'll say that's why warmth is important. And we think the fundamental idea is a good one, but that the target is a little bit misplaced, and it's really character that is going to give you the most reliable signal about somebody's intentions. A slightly separate point is that the strength of a person's character, which is arguably different from the basic goodness or badness of their character, should determine how reliably they will fulfill their intentions, whether or not they be good or bad. So both of these ideas depend on a certain kind of self-interested set of considerations. I should care about your character and you about mine because of what it's going to predict about how we'll treat each other. Although that may not exhaust the reasons why we might care about character in other people. So one of the other ideas we have in play here is this sense that character may be seen as a particularly fundamental aspect of human identity, and the idea that people may care about character partly for that sort of symbolic reason in addition to these more self-interested considerations. Okay, so the overall set of hypotheses here are first, moral character and not warmth is going to be principally important in a range of person perception processes, and we're mainly focused on global impression formation, but we're also interested in predicting a number of properties of traits, such as whether traits are seen as being fundamental to identity, whether they're seen as being desirable in self and others, and also whether they're seen as being controllable. Okay, so here's just a little schematic of our ideas here. The claim is not that morality and warmth are completely distinct. There is certainly some overlap, but they are at least somewhat distinct, and we think it's the moral stuff that's going to do the lion's share of the work in predicting impression formation and other kinds of person perception stuff. Okay, so I'm going to try to get through the description of 8 studies here. The first one is a norming study. This study doesn't really have any findings per se, but I want to describe it because it was very important for setting the stage for some of our later studies. So don't be too underwhelmed when we get to the end of that and there's not really anything there. I'll go briefly through this study, which is looking at trying to predict trait properties. And then studies 3 through 8 all converge on this idea of trying to predict global impression formation. Okay, so the first study is this norming study, and the idea is to try to conduct this sort of bottom-up exercise where we measure the extent to which traits are seen as relevant to character or to warmth and to a bunch of other things. Okay, so we started with 170 traits, and for each of these traits we asked the subjects to say, if you knew this trait about someone, how useful would that be then for judging the person's moral character, their goodness or badness as a person, their morality or immorality? Not surprisingly, those 3 things correlate extremely well together. And then we also, of course, asked people how useful this trait would be for judging someone's warmth, and a closely related construct in the literature, communion. And then we also asked about a couple of other properties of interest. I'm just going to show them but not talk about them any further. So agency, strength of will, grittiness, personality, and ability. So we selected the traits from a number of different a priori categories just to give you a sense of the kinds of things we have in there. We have both good and bad moral traits, so kind, caring, compassionate, and their antonyms in the negative category. We have strength and weakness of will traits. There's a lot more, but just to give you a basic sense. There are positive and negatively valenced personality traits that are not as central to morality. These are things that you might see in the big five. And then we also have positive and negative ability traits. Okay, so there's 170 of them total. In total, we had over 1,000 adults do this study because there are so many traits you can't reasonably ask any one subject to rate 170 traits on 10 questions. We split it up into bins of 17 traits. And then the aggregated means that result from this sort of analysis of what form the platform for the later studies. Okay, so that's study one, that's this norming exercise. I'm also going to go fairly quickly through study two because the analyses are a bit more complicated, but I'll just give you a bit of a sense of this. The idea with study two was now that we know the extent to which these traits are seen as relevant for character and relevant for warmth, can we use those indices to predict the extent to which traits are seen as being fundamental to identity? So we had a number of measures of that. The extent to which traits are seen as being controllable and changeable by the person's own volition, the extent to which they're desirable. The basic upshot of this study was that in each of those respects, the character relevance of the traits is a much stronger predictor of each of these three properties than the warmth relevance. So they're much more fundamental to identity, they're more controllable, and they're also more desirable in self and others. Okay, so I can say more about the analyses there if you're interested later, but let me turn to the studies now that are focusing on global impression formation. This has been a dependent variable of considerable interest in the person perception literature. The usual question, which we relied on to a large extent, is simply how positive or negative is your overall impression of this person. And we want to predict that in various ways. So the first study we ran here was a correlational study where we asked people to think of people that they had come across in their everyday lives or that they knew about through the news. There were 7 different people, so sometimes they were personal connections, other times presidents of the United States. And we asked them to think deeply about this person, vividly imagine what this person is like, and then having done that, we then asked them to rate this person on a range of different trait measures. And here's where the study one norming stuff comes into play for us, because we selected traits based on whether they're high on character or low and high on warmth and vice versa. So we had some traits that we knew from study one were rated as extremely relevant to character and not that relevant to warmth, so being just, principled, honest. And just as a little aside, honest and trustworthy fall into this bin, even though they've sometimes been treated as warmth traits by two-dimensional theorists. Our data shows that that's not really too accurate. There are other traits here. These are the pure warmth traits that we know are highly relevant to warmth, not so relevant to character, being sociable, funny, enthusiastic, and so forth. Traits that are high on both, and then traits that are high on neither, but are high on some ability measure. And then the dependent variable of interest is just how positive or negative is your overall impression of this person. So the way we conducted the analysis, we aggregate these traits together into 4 different indices and then run regression analyses where we're trying to predict positivity or negativity of impressions in regressions where we're controlling for shared variance amongst the predictors. So here are the results. We have our 7 different targets and the 4 different trait bins, and these are the regression coefficients in multiple regression, and you can see that the morality traits are doing the lion's share of the work here. They're significant predictors controlling for all of the other predictors across all 7 targets. The morality and warmth traits are doing a little bit for the friend and parent, but not as much as the moral traits, interestingly. We hadn't necessarily predicted that. The main comparison of interest is between these different categories, morality and warmth. And as you can see, the warmth stuff is not doing much at all once you control for moral character. It does a little bit over here, but even there, the moral traits are doing a bit more. Ability matters particularly for presidents, which is a sensible result, doesn't matter quite as much for the other people. Okay, so this is the first line of support showing that moral character seems to matter more than warmth for global impressions, but obviously this is correlational. There are familiar problems with drawing causal inferences. So we next wanted to run a series of experiments where we manipulate the information that you receive about a particular social target and then look at the extent to which that drives impressions. And so in these next studies, we can draw more clear-cut causal inferences. So the first one is really straightforward. It's almost a toy study before we get to the sort of real ones. But the basic idea here is we gave people 4 different descriptions at a very summary level. So a person who has good moral character and is warm, a person who has good moral character and is cold, a person who has bad moral character and is warm, a person who has bad moral character and is cold. So this is kind of just a basic litmus test for the hypothesis. And then people say, it's a very sort of antiseptic design because we don't say, what's the context, who is this person? We don't say anything about that. It's just how positive or negative is your impression. We did this both between and within subjects. I'm going to show you the between subjects data, I think, but it's basically identical either way. So what you see here, these are the positivity of the overall impressions, and you can see that both character and warmth are doing a lot, but the overall effect of character is substantially larger than the effect of warmth. And one sort of key comparison for showing that is that the good cold person is rated much more positively than the bad warm person. Okay, so there are obvious limitations with this. One is that we're using these summary descriptions so the point of the study is fairly transparent to subjects. We're saying good character and warm. You might wonder about what happens if you do this at a more subtle trait level. So that's one thing we did next. And also, as I mentioned, this is contextually totally unspecified, and you might wonder, well, what about different contexts? Aren't there some contexts where character doesn't matter so much? Maybe warmth is particularly important in some contexts. We'd better investigate that. Yeah.
Can you just remind me of what's the question for global impression?
Global impression here is simply how positive or negative is your overall impression of this person.
That's what you asked them to rate it on.
Yeah, and so 9 is basically extremely positive, 1 is extremely negative. Okay, so moving to this next experiment then, here we ask people to provide, again, overall impressions in a slightly different way, I'll show you that in a second, of 4 different targets. All 4 of the targets were described as lacking certain abilities. This was constant across all of them. We were a little concerned that if we didn't do this, we were just going to get ceiling effects. So we have this sort of negative information as a constant, but it is constant. And then in addition to that, the targets were described as possessing good character traits only. We don't include this description, it's just the traits. And once again, we know this from the ratings in study 1. Another target was described as warm only. A third target, both warm and high character, and a fourth target has no redeeming features above the poor ability traits. And okay, so then we asked people to imagine this person fulfilling a series of different roles in social life. And so we had 12 different roles in total, and here they are. So the idea with this is to try to capture as many different sorts of contexts as we could reasonably ask subjects to judge in a single experiment. And the thought was, let's see how general the predominance of character, if it indeed exists, is across these different targets. So for each one, this was done within subjects, and the profile was consistent, and the subjects just had to say, so imagine this person is your surgeon. How pleased would you be that they're fulfilling this role for you? Overall, how positive or negative do you feel about that? And so those are the DVs. At the end of the study, we also asked people to say, we came back to them and said, okay, here are the 12 roles. We'd like you to indicate how important is it that somebody performs this role well. The thought here was that we wanted to see whether this might moderate the relative dominance of character over warmth. We thought that as the roles increase in importance, we might see character dominating over warmth to a greater extent. So we can look at that. Okay, so there are a lot of numbers here, but I'll just explain what this is. We have our 12 different roles here, our trait conditions here. The thing to focus on is within each row, the difference in the numbers. And I've bolded the cases that were rated most positively. This is on a 0 to 100 scale. Over here, we've got the importance ratings. And so you can see that the moral warm and the moral person were, by and large, rated most positively. And the bold numbers are significantly different from the non-bolded numbers. Very little difference between these 2 categories. The key comparison of interest is here, the moral versus the warm person. And you can see that in general, the moral person is rated more positively than the warm person. So that's true for 9 out of the 12 roles. There are 3 exceptions down here where there's no difference. It trends such that the moral person is rated more positively, but it's not significant. But you'll also notice that these are rated as the least important roles. And so when you correlate the importance ratings with the relative difference between the moral and the warm cases, you get a significant correlation. This is showing that as the role increases in importance, so too does the role of character. Okay, so that's the second experiment. The third one is very similar, but the experimental manipulation was slightly different. So I'll just go through that one. Same 12 contexts. This time we pit warmth and morality against each other, much like in that summary description study I just showed you, but this time at the level of traits. So one person is moral and warm, another person moral and cold, immoral and warm, immoral and cold. So compared to the previous study, we have these cases where they're sort of pushing up against each other. Okay, the prediction is the same and the results are largely similar as well. So not surprisingly here, this is the person that has 2 positive things. They're rated most positively for all 12 roles. But of most interest is what's going on in these 2 cells. And once again, the red numbers indicate cases that accorded with the prediction, such that the moral and cold person was rated more positively than the immoral and warm person. And once again, that was true for 9 out of the 12 roles, so there's a sort of general predominance here. The exception cases, there was no difference. Once again, though, they're the least important cases. So if you correlate the importance ratings, once again, it predicts the relative predominance of the morality over the warmth information. Okay, so that's some experimental evidence now. Now, with any experiment of this sort, you might worry, well, okay, but we as the experimenters get the choice to pick the traits. Is there some possibility that bias is seeping into the way we select our stimuli? We think that's unlikely for these experiments because we selected all of the traits primarily based on the study one, in fact entirely based on the study 1 ratings. But nonetheless, you might have a stimuli selection concern of this sort. So the next thing we did, or actually I'm not sure if this was in chronological order, but let's pretend it was in chronological order, was to do a open-ended conceptual replication where we just ask people in a very unconstrained way, what are the most important attributes of the prospective husband of your hypothetical 30-year-old daughter and of a work colleague? And so they're totally unconstrained to give us back traits that we're interested in. And what we see, so essentially what you do through counting the traits is you sort of get a top 10 list of traits basically for each of these roles. And the bold ones we know are character traits from our study 1 rating. So being compassionate, caring, honest, loyal, loving, are at the top for the daughter's husband. Now, there are some non-moral things. Having money is a good thing. Intellect, sense of humour, interestingly, is basically the only pure warmth trait that we see emerging in these 2 lists. And then we get character stuff again. The co-worker, once again, character traits are at the top. And interestingly, these occurred much more frequently than things like intelligence or even effective communication. Okay, so we think that gives some assurance about any worry about stimulus sampling. So the last thing we did was we wanted to look at this in a slightly more naturalistic context. I say slightly more, it's maybe not that much more naturalistic, but it is slightly different. So here we turn to the obituary pages in the New York Times, and here we were interested in what sort of information gets conveyed in summary level accounts of a person's entire life, and from the information that's conveyed in that, how does that then determine impressions that people form of the person? So starting right after the Character Project conference last year, we went to the obituary archive and then sampled in reverse chronological order until we had 250 of these obituaries. And for each one, we asked 2 research assistants who didn't know what we were up to and weren't at all aware of what the purpose of this study was, to read through all of the obituaries, which was a Herculean task, for each one to indicate how much information is conveyed about each of these 3 aspects. We gave them more elaborated descriptions. And then to indicate as well what the valence was, because unfortunately not everyone has a positive obituary. Most people do, but there are a few unlucky people in the set. Separate from that, we then asked over 1,000 M-Turkers to read these obituaries. They each got 3 each because they're quite long. And they answered some comprehension questions. We wanted to make sure that they were paying attention. And then they simply say, how positive or negative is your overall impression of this person? In some cases, in rare cases, they recognize the person, and the analyses are the same whether you include or exclude those people. or those cases, I should say. Okay, so here are the results. Most information is actually conveyed about ability in these obituaries, which is not surprising here because these are all notable deaths. The reason we selected notable deaths is we first of all wanted to use sort of paid death notices, but they just don't contain enough information. It's just this person died, leaving these people. So that's not too surprising. Of most interest to us is the fact that more information overall was rated as being conveyed about character than about warmth. But of most interest is the regression analyses. So we put the coders rating in as predictors of the overall impressions, and in fact, all of them emerge as significant predictors controlling for the other one. And so ability and character have the largest regression coefficients. Most important for us is that once again, we see the character information beating out warmth information as a predictor of people's global impressions. Okay, so overall, we think this provides a fairly convergent picture on the sort of basic model I outlined at the start. Morality and warmth as separable, with character as playing the key role in driving people's global impressions. So I just want to conclude by raising a couple of further questions, suggesting a couple of avenues for future research. From a social cognition perspective, I think the key thing to grapple with here is, well, what does this mean for these popular two-dimensional models? At the very least, we think it means that they need some revision. I think the key question that needs to be answered is what exactly is the relation between moral character and warmth, which has been so touted within this literature. There are a few things you might say. Well, so one thing you might say is that character is just basically a part of warmth, and implicitly this seems to be the position that's been adopted by Fisk and colleagues, because they never really say anything much about character and it's just kind of lumped together. We think that view is wrong based on our data. So another thing you could say is, well, character is sort of a part of warmth, but it's an especially important part of warmth, and that's a view that's been taken by Brambilla and colleagues. We're also not too inclined to adopt that view either, because the trouble with this is what you do with the character traits like being honest, just, and principled, which we now know don't have a huge amount to do with warmth. The converse position is, well, okay, warmth is just part of character, and maybe you could say, well, what this research shows is that the dimension has just been misidentified. It's really character and not warmth. But once again, I think there's a problem with this view, which is what do you do with the pure warmth traits, which we now know are rated highly relevant to warmth, but not that relevant to character. If they're part of character, why would you see those sorts of ratings? So the third alternative, probably doesn't exhaust the alternatives, but the third one is to just say, look, these are three separate dimensions. And this is the view that we currently favour. We're starting to run some studies now to test whether or not this is the case. We have some suggestive evidence that this may actually be correct, but more definitely needs to be done on that. So that's it. Thank you very much. And thank you for the
questions?
So I thought it was very interesting. It was so nice that the studies fit together so well. My main concern is about this category of being immoral but warm.
Right.
Because then it looks like the warmth might not be a real inner feeling. It's just the way you behave. So this person's a charlatan.
Right.
And of course I don't want to marry my daughter. And of course I because they're just faking warmth. They're not really warm. And so I wonder, I don't know how that plays into all the different results because I couldn't keep it all straight. But I wonder, did you do anything to try to control for that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the worry is, it's not genuine warmth in those cases, right? I guess my response is going to be, in the studies where we do that, no, we don't control for it. It's arguably a problem in those studies. But I think the line I would probably take in response to that is, there are studies where when you just present the information in isolation, this person has the character traits, this person has the warmth traits, you see that the character stuff still wins. So I guess I would want to rest on those studies as well as some of the correlational and regression studies as suggesting that probably doesn't undercut the whole picture. But I agree, you have this worry about authenticity, and off the top of my head, I can't think, within that sort of study, how would you address it? I'd need to think a bit more.
I really like this idea, and it's sort of similar to other data that I've collected as well, but I One thing I think is interesting about warmth and character going together is you can clearly separate it conceptually and when you describe people, but I think in interpersonal context, we're much more likely to confuse warmth for character than we are to confuse ability for character. And I think we're, a person who's social, the politician, right, who's social, we just assume they have good character, but we don't always make that with ability. And I'm wondering if kind of how your perspective on conceptually we can separate it in a questionnaire when we write out descriptions, but in reality, especially first impressions, it's much harder.
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways, I think that's an important point, that that there can be a certain substitution or confusion that might occur. I think typically what happens is that warmth is first of all more visible, and you also tend to get it earlier in social interactions than you get information about character. Now, you obviously can see character sometimes immediately, but generally it takes a more repeated pattern of behaviour, and you need to see it over time a little bit more. So one of the things we've been sort of interested in is trying to investigate the naturalistic time course of evidence gathering about these two different dimensions, and we suspect that you're going to see warmth earlier, character later, and that that confusion that you might get is going to probably be resolved the longer that you know someone. But I think it's an interesting idea.
No, actually, I didn't think of my question until I heard these comments, from Walter and I. And I mean, did you do a study where you had neutral as the, because it's your point is to try to separate these out, right? But as Walter's comment, I thought was addressing, you kind of force them to be separate by putting the contrast as a warm, immoral person.
Yeah, not always. Sometimes,
like,
but not always.
Did you ever do warm, neutral? Like, what was the upshot of what you got from the obituary study? Like, what was the contribution of that?
It basically just shows that, once again, the extent to which the obituary is conveying information about character is a stronger predictor of the overall impression that a person forms having read that obituary.
I see.
So it's very similar to the earlier correlational study, but just with a different sort of stimulus.
Let me ask you this, and it really is a follow-up to the question I heard Walter say is, do you have any studies where you didn't have this conflating of, immoral and warm combined as the alternative? Which ones did you do that?
So we did it in the first. Let me just go back here.
I wasn't thinking about that as a way of organizing. It makes a lot of sense because the point is to, push apart the dimensions. That would do it artificially.
Right. So if you go back to this one.
And you know what? The early work on attractiveness, when swindlers are attractive, then attractiveness backfires for them. That was in the past. Social psychologists discovered that. And it reminds me of this. Right.
So I mean, this study here is one where they're not forced against each other. You're given this information, and then you're just given either this or this or this. So the worry that the warmth traits are not real in that case because they're also the warmth traits are not real because they're also paired with immorality, I don't think is in play for this study. And then you've the correlational studies as well, where you're just rating a person on traits, and they're not pushed against each other. Is not susceptible to that criticism either, but it's correlational. So.
Sorry. My question is about the nature of the self-reporting in the studies.
Yeah.
So I guess I might be inclined to think that I would say I have a higher overall impression of somebody who is moral but cold. But really in my behavior, I might have a higher overall impression of someone who's warm but immoral.
Yep.
And I might even actually, but not sort of want to say or have access to that.
So I think that is a legitimate worry, although I guess I'm not too concerned about it for many of these designs, because the subjects don't have to explicitly say, I value character, and that's the way I'm forming my impressions. All they're doing is sort of saying, given this information, how positive or negative. Often they don't know what the comparative condition is. And even in the trait rating studies, they're just rating traits and then giving a global impression. It's hard to see how they would sort of rig their trait rating such that they come across as a person who values character. So I'd be much more concerned with that if we sort of had a really, what do you value type question, which we don't. So
going back to Walter, your first question, that, and also kind of tied to this question about the kind of the combination of the warm and low character.
Yeah.
But the idea that having for a character kind of changes your interpretation of one's ostensible warmth. It's kind of interesting too, if that's what's going on, because it still shows the power of character to change one's, and that goes, that's one of the reasons I think like in some ways you have the kind of very Solomon Ash type of study here. And that's, and I don't know if you have the ability to kind of look at that, like to what degree does character change the meaning of warmth compared to what degree does warmth change the, if you have someone who's warm and low character kind of even pit their moderator effects on each other.
That's really cool. We have no data that can address that right now because we didn't sort of ask for that as an intervening variable, but I like that idea. It's interesting. Yeah, that's good.
So have you ever heard of Mayer's model of trust? He talks about he finds someone trustworthy if they combine ability, benevolence, and integrity. And as I'm looking at these things, I'm thinking, well, benevolence is kind of being warm, integrity is character, and ability is ability, right? So the outcome is a little different. You're talking general impressions. He's talking trusting someone. But trusting, he argues, is a behavior. So kind of moving from a positive impression to actually acting on it. But one of the things he finds is that, at least with Americans, they often conflate benevolence and integrity has a different weight in how they act and the abilities does. So kind of what I want to drive is, I'm kind of assuming this is mostly an American sample.
Yes, all American sample.
Okay. Do you think other cultures are going to weight character and warmth and ability in the same way? Because at least with his model, the one time it's been done with Asians versus Canadians, there's very different emphasis on factors that they weighted. You still see kind of that, the three dimensions, but with different parts. And so I'm just asking you to speculate on how you see it unfolding, and I guess tying with that behavior question of, you start with impression and how you actually act, because I might act more on someone's actually ability to do something than just how warm.
Okay, so I'll try out some speculations. I guess the first thing I would say is I wouldn't treat benevolence as warmth, because our data shows that there are these character traits that are very high in warmth, like being kind, benevolent, and so forth, which do function quite differently from sociable, funny. But given that...
So do you think benevolence kind of, because that's actually, is it kind of a combination high character, high warmth?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. So that benevolent, I think, is maybe not in these studies, but in the data it looks high character, high warmth. I mean, obviously, sort of the cliched response to the cross-cultural question is, well, what do East Asians do? How might we know the most about them? And perhaps given that, there's some suggestion they have a more interdependent communal culture, possibly you might predict that warmth is going to be more important. But I don't have intuitive confidence in that prediction. I'm just not sure. You might, or perhaps there are more. I mean, I know there's some work on certain cultures having a sort of more stoic expression of emotions than American culture. I think Russians and Japanese culture, there's some evidence for that. So maybe there you might see warmth play even less of a role. But yeah, it's an interesting question. And
the other interesting part about this is I also think about ability as being very situationally linked, and you're kind of comparing the character warmth stuff, which is this inside me stuff. So if you take someone and ask for a global impression just of the person, then I can see ability being kind of way differently. But once you ask them their impression of the character that's why I thought the role stuff has a lot of potential, and maybe work more on that role stuff, because then I think ability can start to really pop out and say that's going to matter more than other things, especially if it's a role where there's high dependence. So there's a lot of potential there, I think, to take it in the direction of roles and culture, and then look at that situation, personality.
No, I agree, yeah. And looking more at ability is something we haven't done yet. So.
Do you think that we'd see any differences if we asked people, how do you think other people would view these, the targets? That is not asking them how they, the participants, view these targets, but how do you think other people in general would view this person? Do you think then warmth might start to shine through a bit more? People think, oh yeah, he's warm, other people are going to really like him. Possibly. That's an interesting thought.
That's one of the questions actually that Fisk uses in some of her research, which is to say, what do you think that the typical American stereotype of this particular group would be? And it's not your own response. I think that I could buy a prediction like that, such that you might think that warmth matters more for other people. It's interesting, yeah. worth testing.
Could you go back to study 3? So I guess my question is, I'm wondering about the relationship among morality warrants and morality warrants.
The correlations, yeah. I can't remember the correlations off the top of my head. I mean, with all of these things, we check for multicollinearity, and there's really no problem with
Really?
that. Yeah. I was a little surprised by that as well. I just can't remember. I can't remember the raw correlations to give you that number.
Okay. So in this analysis, if you take out morality warrants, do you get pretty much the same results in terms of like relative strength of those?
Yeah, I think it might even turn out to be a bit stronger there. Yeah.
Okay. I was just wondering because I guess if you like partial R morality and warrants.
Yeah.
And then if morality warrants correlates both with morality and warrants, you like differentially, I guess partial shows them out. That might explain the results, but if you get the same results with that out.
Yeah. I'm going to go back and check that after your question, but I'm pretty sure, 99% confident that it's as strong, if not stronger, if you take that first thing out.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Geoff.
Okay, thanks very much.